Welcome to the workshop, Agent Orange, the Lasting Legacy of the American War in Vietnam. I am Marjorie Cohn, part of the leadership core of Vietnam Agent Orange Relief and Responsibility Campaign, which is a task force of Veterans for Peace, and we educate the American people about the lingering legacy of Agent Orange in Vietnam and the United States, and urge the US to take responsibility for what it did to the Vietnamese people, American vets, and the land of Vietnam. I am Professor Emerita at Thomas Jefferson School of Law and a former president of the National Lawyers Guild. I'm a member of the Bureau of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, and I am a proud member of the Advisory Board of Veterans for Peace. I served as one of 7 judges from 3 continents on the International People's Tribunal of Conscience in support of the Vietnamese victims of Agent Orange in Paris in 2009. Kathy Gilbert and I wrote Rules of Disengagement, the Politics and Honor of Military Dissent. 60 years ago, the US sprayed approximately 19 million gallons of 15 different herbicides, collectively known as Agent Orange, over Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Between 2.1 and 4.8 million Vietnamese were exposed during the spraying, and many more continue to be exposed through the environment. Agent Orange exposure continues to negatively affect the lives of men and women in Vietnam and in the United States. Agent Orange exposure is associated with cancers, immune deficiencies, reproductive illnesses, and severe birth defects in Vietnamese, American, and Vietnamese Americans directly exposed, as well as their children and grandchildren. In 1979, US veterans of the Vietnam War sued the US government and the chemical companies, including Dow and Monsanto, for compensation resulting from their exposure to Agent Orange. The case settled out of court in 1984 for $180 million, which gave a few of the plaintiffs a few $1,000s each. Later, US veterans won a legislative victory for compensation, and they received several $billion per year in benefits. Vietnamese victims of Agent Orange filed a lawsuit in 2004 against the chemical companies that manufactured Agent Orange. In 2008, US District Court Judge Jack Weinstein, who had also presided over the US veterans lawsuit, dismissed the case brought by the Vietnamese people, concluding that Agent Orange did not constitute a poison weapon prohibited by the Hague Convention of 1907. Weinstein reportedly told the chemical companies when they settled the US veterans lawsuit that their liability was over, and he apparently made good on that promise. His 2008 dismissal was affirmed by the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and the Supreme Court declined to hear the case. In the film, The People versus Agent Orange, Weinstein says that the veterans case, quote, was not settled on any scientific basis, it was settled on a political basis. The moment it was settled, the chemical company's stock went up, unquote. US veterans who continue to suffer Agent Orange related diseases were exposed to, but were not the intended victims of the deadly chemicals. Nevertheless, the US government is paying for their compensation, while private companies that manufactured the chemicals, which they knew to contain deadly dioxin, have not paid the price for allowing the United States to use those chemicals in the first place. Moreover, those companies profited from their sales of Agent Orange to the government. The Vietnamese victims, the intended victims, have received little to no compensation. On May the 25th, Representative Barbara Lee of California introduced H.R. 3518, the Victims of Agent Orange Relief Act of 2021, in the House of Representatives. The Vietnam Agent Orange Relief and Responsibility Campaign, which I said is a project of VFP, assisted Lee in drafting the bill. Congresswoman Lee said, quote, "The United States has a moral responsibility to compensate the victims of the Agent Orange campaign. In the same way, we are focused on beginning to repair the damage of systemic racism in the form of reparations and the war on drugs with restorative justice. It is also our responsibility to try and atone for the disgraceful campaign during the Vietnam War." On August 10th, which was the 60th anniversary of the Agent Orange, beginning of the spraying of Agent Orange, and August 10th is known as the Agent Orange Day for the victims of Agent Orange. Ambassador Nguyen Phuong Nha, who was the former ambassador to the United Nations from Vietnam and president of the Vietnam Union of Friendship Organizations, wrote a letter to us, to the Vietnam Agent Orange Relief and Responsibility Campaign, saying, "I would like to express my profound gratitude to each and every one of you for long companionship, sharing, and invaluable support over the past decades. You have done incredible works during and after the war to help Vietnam. The Vietnamese people appreciate and cherish each and every of your efforts, whether to clean up dioxin, contaminated lands, or provide treatment, healthcare, and rehabilitation for those exposed to Agent Orange dioxin and their progeny affected by this toxin, or support to the legal fight for justice and legitimate rights of the Vietnamese victims of Agent Orange dioxin." Madam Nha, Ambassador Nha, awarded the Medal of Friendship to Paul Cox, who unfortunately was unable to participate in this panel today. Paul, a member of the Board of Directors of Veterans for Peace, has led several VFP delegations to Vietnam and is a member of the leadership core of Vietnam Agent Orange Relief and Responsibility Campaign. This workshop will present an overview of the use of Agent Orange dioxin in Southeast Asia, studies on the deleterious impact of the chemicals sprayed directly on the Vietnamese and US troops, transgenerational harm to the children born to US soldiers and Vietnamese, and the Veterans for Peace campaign to get HR 3518 passed into law. Our first presenter will be Dr. Nguyen Tai Phuong, which is a recorded presentation. She delivered babies affected by Agent Orange. Our second presenter is Susan Schnall, who will talk about this bill, this legislation, and medical issues stemming from exposure to Agent Orange. And Tricia Uvar, who will speak to the activities of the collective in Paris that has been supporting Madame Tran Ton Nha's case against the chemical companies for compensation for the spraying of Agent Orange. Thank you.
Dear friends, today I will talk to you about the effects of toxic chemicals, especially Agent Orange dioxin on the reproductive health in Vietnam. Dioxins are highly toxic and can cause cancers, reproductive and developmental problems, damage to the immune system, and can interfere with hormones. 2,3,7,8 tetrachlorodibenzopyridioxin, or TCD, was the one evaluated and classified by the WHO's International Agency for Research and Cancer since 1997 as a non-human carcinogen. The other dioxin produced in industries having more iron chloride in the chemical composition, they are less toxic. Dioxins are unwanted byproducts of manufacturing processes of some herbicides, defoliants, and pesticides. Nowadays, dioxins are found throughout the world in the environment, and they accumulate in food chain, concentrating mainly in the fat tissue of animals. Due to the highly toxic potential, efforts need to be undertaken to reduce current background exposure. Due to the omnipresence of dioxins, all people have background exposure and certain level of dioxin in the body, leading to the so-called body burden. Prevention or reduction of human exposure is best done via source-directed measures. For example, strict control of industrial processes to reduce formation of dioxin. But in the past, during the wartime in Vietnam, about 365 kilos of TCDD have been spread upon more than 20,585 hamlets, with millions of Vietnamese living there, including thousands of American Vietnam veterans. So that dioxin contamination has been especially more significant, with further implication in Vietnam. Large amounts of dioxins were also released in a serious accident at a chemical factory in Seveso, Italy. In 1976, a cloud of toxic chemicals, including TCDD, was released into the air and eventually contaminated an area of 15 square kilometers where 37,000 people lived. Once dioxin entered the body, they last a long time because of their chemical stability and their ability to be absorbed by fat tissue, where they are then stored in the body. The half-life in the body is estimated to be 7 to 11 years. In the environment, dioxin tend to accumulate in the food chain, a link to certain types of cancers, as well as about more than 20 diseases is investigated and confirmed by many scientists. Short-term exposure of humans to high levels of dioxin may result in skin lesions such as acne and patchy darkening of the skin and alter the liver functions. Long-term exposure is linked to impairment of the immune system, the developing nervous system, the endocrine system, and reproductive functions. Chronic exposure to dioxin has resulted in several types of cancer. A study from Vietnam revealed soldiers who had stayed for more than 10 years in the south of Vietnam had a significantly increased risk for liver cancer with OR equal to 8.8. Westing and his colleagues, as well as many scientists in many countries, have analyzed dioxin in human blood or adipose tissue and concluded during the first conference on the long-term consequences of defoliants and herbicides used in Vietnam during the wartime held in Ho Chi Minh City in January 1983, that average dioxin level in spread areas in Vietnam was 150 times higher than standard of former Soviet Union and 50 times higher than those of Europe Union. An estimated dioxin intake of people living in Agent Orange spread areas during the American War, including the American troops, was 4 milligrams per kilogram of body weight per 24 hours, compared to acceptable standard in the US, 0.1 picograms per kilograms per 24 hours. It means that 40 billion times higher than acceptable level. The experts of WHO established a provisional tolerable monthly intake of only 70 picograms per kilograms per month. Our particularly great concern must be paid about our future. The fetus of exposed mother can have serious toxic on the hypothalamic pituitary ovary axis, causing reproductive hormonal disorders, influencing its future, especially sexual immaturity with the exposure to dioxin during the fetal life. More than that, dioxin are highly oil soluble, but insoluble in water. They thus bioaccumulate in fatty tissue like liver or mammary glands, and then move to the breast milk during the baby breastfeeding period. That's why dioxin can be transmitted from the exposed mothers to their offspring and then to the next generation. Baughman and Michelson in 1973 and Baughman in 1974 found elevated levels of dioxin in human breast milk samples from mothers living in the spread areas in Bình Dương province in the south of Vietnam. In many cases, extremely high values were found on the lipid weight basis. Level as high as 1,450 picograms per gram could be found. Mean dioxin level of the positive samples was 1,984 picograms per gram, and the range varies from 132 to 4,450. In 1985, human milk samples from mothers living in areas of heavy spraying with Agent Orange still show dioxin levels of 50 to 232 picograms per gram on lipid basis. Due to these facts, millions newborn babies have been exposed to dioxin and suffered later its long-term consequences without knowing how and why. Here are some dioxin level in breast milk of women living in different countries. You see here, dioxin, Quebec in Canada, in Japan, in the US, in Vietnam, Hanoi, in Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh City, and Vietnam spread areas during the wartime, Sông Bé, and Vietnam, Cần Giờ spread areas. They see the spread areas, the breast milk has very high level, even in 1988. Junzo Yunemoto from the National Institute for Environment Studies in Japan in 2000 said that the developing fetus is most sensitive to dioxin exposure. Newborn with rapidly developing organ system may also be more vulnerable to certain effects. The developmental effects of dioxin are important because the high sensitivity as well as the irreversibility and longevity of the effects. In animal experiments, exposure to dioxin during pregnancy and lactation induce various functional effects on offspring at a very low doses. In human, even if there is no exposure to dioxin after birth, there might be effects on thyroid function in infants exposed to dioxin from breast milk. Shunzo Yunemoto reported that low dose of dioxin can cause many harmful effects on offspring in animal and human being experiments. I can tell you that From 1963 to 1969, I was a medical student in the Saigon Medical University. I remember once when I was on duty in Tuzhou Hospital, I have delivered for the first time an anencephalic baby with no brain. It was too terrible for me and for the mothers too. The mother cried and shouted, "Oh, I delivered a monkey. My baby is a monkey. Why? Why so?" She could not stop to cry and shout continuously for many days and nights. And I myself, I also cried and could not sleep for a long time after that event. Why so the case? From then, I came to Tuzhou Hospital more frequently at the night time to deliver more babies, and was also thinking continuously, why so the case? I could not explain to the mother and to myself. From then, I delivered many more deformed babies of various types, about 2-3 times a week. I was always beset with cares about those cases, and I have asking my professor for allowing me to conserve those deformed fetuses in order to study to find out later the cause of those babies' different upsetting deformities. Then in 1976, when the American Vietnam veterans came back to Vietnam, they visited Tuzhou Hospital and asked about the different birth defects born in Tuzhou Hospital during and after the wartime. I was ordered to the responsibility to answer their questions. I had to look for the documents in the hospital data and the graduated doctoral thesis left in the Saigon Medical University library. And I was lucky to get a copy of documents of the US Academy of Sciences published in 1974 on the spring missions of many agents over Vietnam during the wartime. After comparing what I read, what I saw in those collected materials, I realized that the toxic chemical spraying is certainly the cause of my deformed newborn babies I delivered before. And here's the rate of birth defects in Tuzhou Hospital before and after the spraying mission. You see, it's very high as compared with before. And here are some rate of deformed babies, congenital malformations from 1982 survey of abnormal pregnancy outcomes among exposed women living in Thành Phong Bến Tre compared to that of unexposed women living in Ho Chi Minh City. And you see the congenital malformations rate is among the exposed mothers is much higher in Thành Phong village. In the exposed women in District 1 in Ho Chi Minh City is much higher than among the non-exposed women. The difference is very significant, significantly. The difference of the difference between the rate of congenital malformations among the exposed as compared with non-exposed is very statistically significant. And in Hanoi in 1982, among the exposed and non-exposed people of the wife of veterans, the total children and birth defects is also very different, much higher among the veterans children and the non-exposed couples children. And here are some deformities. The anencephaly, the meningocele of the cervical spine, and no limbs. Here, limbs deformities. And there is defects of sensory organs called holoprosenso. Yeah, it's sensory organs deform the nose and eyes. And here's control twins. I think at the present times, we don't need to spend time to discuss whether dioxin can cause cancer or disease or not, or both effects or not. Instead, we should solve the problems caused by Agent Orange and dioxin to detect in utero congenital malformation at a very early stage of pregnancy, to explain and counsel the family about the situation of the fetus health, and to help them to have a good decision, to make diagnosis of cancers as soon as possible, to be able to efficiently treat the patients, to have new medical equipments, to grasp new technologies, to set up good hospitals, to take care of Agent Orange dioxin victims with merciful attitude. We should also to influence the cleansing of the areas contaminated with dioxin right away, to avoid the exposure to be continued, to make law to strictly control or to prohibit industrial processes causing the formations of dioxin in all countries, to abolish chemical companies related to the manufacture of dioxin contaminated defoliants, herbicides, and pesticides in the past, to recognize their responsibility and to help victims to overcome all consequences of the use of their noxious chemical products. Greater efforts to scientific cooperation from the Vietnam and US scientists would also promote the exchange of best practices and information about dioxin's health effects, so as to benefit the generations of affected Vietnamese people and the US veterans and their families. Here there is a volunteer woman come from England, is taking care of disabled children in Vietnam. And here, Quảng Trị province after spraying in 1967.
Thank you, Dr. Phuong, for that compelling presentation. Now, I just want to say before I introduce our next speaker that we're going to have a question and answer period following the talks. And if you have comments, please put them in the chat. But if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. Thank you. Our next speaker is Susan Schnall. She is a member of the Leadership Corps of the Vietnam Agent Orange Relief and Responsibility Campaign, president of the New York chapter of Veterans for Peace, and a member of the Veterans for Peace Board of Directors. For the past several years, Susan has organized scientific panels for presentations about Agent Orange at the American Public Health Association's annual meetings and at an international conference on Agent Orange in Hanoi, Vietnam. Susan was a nurse in the US Navy, and she was dismissed in 1969 after a general court-martial for her anti-war activities. Thank you, Susan.
Hello and welcome, everybody. It is a special honor today to welcome comrades from Vietnam to this workshop on Agent Orange, the lasting legacy of the American war in Vietnam. Welcome, Mr. Pham Truong, Miss Tran Thi Quay Lung, and Miss Vu Thi Ha to the National Veterans for Peace Convention. It is our honor to have you here. I would like to read to you a letter that we have received from Senior Lieutenant General Nguyen Van Ryn, who is president of the Vietnam Association for the Victims of Agent Orange. Dear friends, on the occasion of the 2021 Convention of Veterans for Peace being held from 12 to 15 August 2021, the Vietnam Association for Victims of Agent Orange Dioxin and more than 3 million victims of Agent Orange in Vietnam send their warmest greetings to all those at the convention and all the members of Veterans for Peace. Working together with VFP for a long time, VAVA very much appreciates the contributions of VFP to the movement of struggle for peace and justice. In particular, benefiting a lot from your support, we always consider you as our main partner in the fight for justice for the victims of Agent Orange. We know that with the theme rising to the moment, your convention of this year will have many workshops, including Agent Orange, Lasting Legacy, the American War in Vietnam. We share your position and with you urgently ask the governments and people of all countries to work together for the fight against war, militarism, and the existence of weapons of mass destruction in any form for a world of peace. We are looking forward to working ever more closely with Veterans for Peace, and we wish you every success in this convention. Mr. Ring. From 1961 to 1971, the United States government undertook massive defoliation programs as an instrument of war. It systematically set out to destroy millions of acres of foliage from the air. Over the years, spraying an estimated 4.8 million Vietnamese and its own American troops on the ground. Spraying was conducted by backpacks around the perimeters of American military bases. The last American troops left Vietnam April 30th, 1975. And I show you the picture of the C-123. There was the aircraft responsible with the men on board of dropping the Agent Orange dioxin over Vietnam. This is a photograph, a personal photograph that was taken of a military base where both the Americans, you can see, were left unprotected from the spraying of the Agent Orange around the perimeter to clear the base of foliage. The Agent Orange dioxin was left in the water that contaminated both the food supply and the showers that the military took. This is a relatively important photograph taken in 1971. It contains a photo of the Vietnamese women clearing Pacer Ivy, Agent Orange, by the women all those years ago. As you can see, the women are wearing no protective gear. Important to remember that Pacer Ivy was a term that was used by the American military to clear Vietnam of all the barrels of Agent Orange dioxin, whether it was in Da Nang, in Bien Hoa, or in some of the other military bases. Again, that did not begin until 1971, which was after the spraying program in Vietnam. I wanted to show you this telegram that arrived in 1970 from the Office of Science and Technology at the White House. They wished to know the extent to which the embassy might be capable of explaining the basis for allegations of birth defects and South Vietnam relating from military employments of defoliants. They state that they realize the allegations of the type referred to have been encountered as long as there have been defoliant programs in Vietnam. So we go back to 1961, that these allegations had been consistent all the while that those defoliants were used in country. The telegram further states that renewed and justified possible concern arising from discovery of possible genetic effects of herbicides. They were requesting an attempt to examine instances of deformities. We never see the response, except for photographs of the children who were either directly sprayed or whose parents were sprayed. This is a photograph that goes back to 1969. It was received by an organization called Medical Aid for Indochina because we were working closely with identifying problems, health problems occurring in Vietnam. A quick picture of a young child at home with her mother. The father had gone south to fight, came back, and the child was born several months later with severe cerebral palsy, some cognitive issues, but obviously still able to relate to the world. She was lucky. She was able to be at home with her mom for many, many years. The next few slides are slides taken of the babies born in Sadu Hospital. As Dr. Fung stated, a baby with hydrocephalus. You can see the enlarged head, and you can see why the mom would have been so distressed when she saw her baby. This is another photograph of a baby, and you again can see the hydrocephalus and the baby unable to see much or participate much or relate to the world. There were a number of studies that were done in the United States on birth defects. And I would say to you that the first couple were very important that occurred in the 1980s. These were studies of the babies born to American servicemen who had been in Vietnam. The two authors, Richard Albanese and Erickson, identified that birth defects were born to the children of the ranch hands. And remember, these were the guys that flew the C-123s that were responsible for spraying Vietnam. They identified a number of birth defects, including skin defects, neural tube defects, heart defects, oral cliffs, and kidney defects. One of the issues with the study that was done by Richard Albanese is that the government decided to change the methodology by which the studies were conducted and said that they didn't identify very many, except for one that has been recognized through the Institute of Medicine. This is a timeline, and I just wanted to share it with you to show that in 1991, it took from the end of American troops on the ground in 1975 until 1991 for Congress to recognize that, in fact, there was an issue of the spraying of Agent Orange that occurred on American troops and on the Vietnamese. They passed the legislation in 91 at the same time recognizing soft tissue sarcoma and chloracne. These two illnesses were identified several years earlier by epidemiologists working in the Boston area that identified early deaths, and they identified that early deaths were occurring with those men who had served in Vietnam. And they also identified the issue of the soft tissue sarcoma as a cause of death. The Institute of Medicine was given the responsibility for coming up with reports every 2 years where they collected studies from around the world and identified those studies that showed the highest incidence of illness with American veterans. They identified Hodgkin's lymphoma in September of 1993. The VA, outside of the Institute of Medicine, had a special task force recognizing respiratory cancers and multiple myeloma. And then we go into 96, where I believe most of us remember that there was finally recognition of one birth defect for the children of American military men, and that was Spina Bifida. These studies go on to 2000, where there was one specific study done by Dr. Kang that recommended that for the American female veterans whose babies were born with birth defects, that every one of those birth defects be recognized and that those babies be given special services and compensation. That was given again to the children born to American female veterans. We believe that the reason for this is that, as you will remember, there were about 5,000 to 6,000 women who served in Vietnam, compared with the 3.4 million men who served. So the numbers made it possible for the government to recognize only the children of American female veterans. There have been multiple studies done over the years that have added Parkinson's, heart disease, certain forms of leukemia. On 2014, what is extraordinary about recognizing the reservists who flew the C-123s 10 years after they were returned to the United States. They identified that the dioxin continued to contaminate the C-123s. So they compensated those reservists who flew the planes 10 years after the end of the war. In 2016, there were ongoing suggestions that additional illnesses be compensated. They included bladder cancer, Parkinson's-like syndrome, and hypothyroidism. Those, in fact, were not covered. Remember, that was 2016. Those illnesses were not covered until last year, when the National Defense Authorization Act made a recommendation that, in fact, those illnesses be covered. There was a corresponding act in the Senate and then a sign off by the president. So 3 additional illnesses were added. I'd like to mention that those studies, in fact, were done in South Korea. They were not done in the United States. But from 2016 to 2020, it took 5 years to cover those additional illnesses. High blood pressure has been recommended for many years as correlated with service in Vietnam. It still is not a covered illness. There have been separate studies that have been proposed through the Institute of Medicine. There is a study that has been done by the Army Chemical Corps, and there is a study done by the Air Force on ranch handers. Despite all of those studies, high blood pressure has still not been covered by the government. I'd like to follow up on Dr. Fung's discussion about the impact on babies and women who live near some of the contaminated areas. In 2009, a study was done by Hatfield, a Canadian organization that studied those women living near Da Nang Airport. And what they found was an additional amount of the level of dioxin in breast milk. They followed the babies of the women for a couple of years, and what they identified in those babies, that they had moderate and high groups that were identified with significantly lower cognitive composite motor development. So there continues to be a problem with the contamination of the land in Vietnam that was caused all those many years ago by the United States use of Agent Orange, dioxin, and the spraying. This is a list today of the 20 some odd illnesses that are covered by the Veterans Administration. And I show you on the right-hand side of the screen the covered birth defects in the children of American women war veterans. Important also to identify, although there were about 5,000 or 6,000 women who served in country, think of all the many millions of Vietnamese women who have delivered babies with congenital birth defects that are related to the use of the American Agent Orange dioxin in Vietnam. There is only one birth defect that continues to be covered by the Veterans Administration, and that is Spina Bifida. I'll show you children from Vietnam born with other significant birth defects. Many of you know Heather Bowser, who is the daughter of an American who served in Vietnam. Heather is a very incredible activist who continues to organize the Children of Vietnam Veterans Health Alliance. And she gathers information of children whose father served in Vietnam who were born with birth defects. Our next slide is bringing people together. I show you two hands, one of a Vietnamese and one of an American, showing you and illustrating the exact birth defects, whether it is in the hands or in the legs. Cleaning, and bear with me through this slideshow as we spend some time talking about the land that has remained contaminated, and to show you what Vietnam looked like before the American use of Agent Orange dioxin and all the various chemicals that were sprayed on the people and the land before the spraying. This shows you again the C-123s that used over 20 million gallons of Agent Orange multiple times over South and Central Vietnam. The impact on the land, what the land looked like immediately following the spraying, and children in the mangrove forest that was heavily sprayed. This map is used to identify 3 of the major hotspots in Vietnam, 2 of which have been cleaned up. Da Nang to the north, and please also take a look at how red the area is there that represents the enormous number of chemicals that were used in Da Nang. If you go a little bit further of Da Nang, you can see Quang Tri province, a small area the size of Rhode Island that was more heavily bombed than both Japan and Germany during the Second World War. Da Nang, the Air Force Base, Phu Quoc, and then Bien Hoa in the south that is near Saigon and certainly near very heavily populated civilian areas. The first area to be cleaned up by the United Nations Development Fund was Phu Quoc. It contained about 1% of the total dioxin from the 3 major sites that we'll be talking about. So Phu Quoc was the first to be cleaned up. I take you now to Da Nang. When you look at 2012, there's 2 main areas that you'll be seeing. One to the right is the storage area where the barrels of Agent Orange were maintained. To the left is what is called the washdown area. It's the area where the C-123s were washed down following the heavy spraying. By 2012, nothing was able to be grown in that area. Nothing. You see them as bald spots on the earth. This just gives you an identification of the most heavily contaminated areas in Da Nang. And again, Da Nang contained 15% of the dioxin that was identified in these three major American military sites. In Da Nang, the cleanup began by isolating the contaminated dirt. It was an extensive process. Rubber matting was laid below. The dirt was then carried over to that area, and rubber matting was placed on top of the area. It was isolated. Then there was what is known as a containment reservoir that was built that contained and dealt with thermal desorption, where this area, the dirt, was heated to 300 degrees Celsius, 500 degrees Fahrenheit for months to decontaminate the dirt. You can see the devices that were used called heating electrodes. They capped the soil, they capped those rubber mats. The liquids and volatile gases were then vacuumed up. And they were incinerated. 94,000 cubic meters of soil was cleaned this way. This is the plaque that states that it took 43 years after the end of the war, decades of negotiations, over $150 million to decontaminate Da Nang. So let me take you now to Bien Hoa, the air base and what it looked like during the war from 1969 to 1970. Important to remember that this air base, although it was an American air base, it was surrounded by a civilian population. This identifies various spots that have been where sampling has occurred. You can see the many spots at Bien Hoa. It was important to take the samples of dirt to identify the various areas of contamination. 84% of the total dioxin from three bases, Phuket, Da Nang, and Bien Hoa, 84% is in Bien Hoa Air Force Base. A quick photograph of the sampling crew in Bien Hoa. This is a plaque that shows the beginning, the identification of the contamination. And this is where that plaque exists today, in the middle of a field, because the contamination efforts have yet to begin. We have HR 3518 that Marjorie has referred to, the Victims of Agent Orange Relief Act of 2021. Let me quickly mention that although the Department of Veterans Affairs recognizes diseases and illness associated with the spraying and the use of Agent Orange by the US Armed Forces during the Vietnam era, the DVA, the Department of Veteran Affairs, provides some, albeit insufficient, compensation for 20 severe congenital disabilities in the children of female US veterans who served in Vietnam. The only congenital condition recognized for children of male veterans is spina bifida. No assistance has been provided to the children of Vietnamese or Vietnamese Americans associated with their exposure or their parents' or grandparents' exposure to Agent Orange. Representative Lee stated that H.R. 3518 would expand benefits to children of veterans exposed to Agent Orange, expand research to Agent Orange and its effects on the health of individuals, and provide medical, housing, and poverty reduction assistance to Vietnamese individuals affected by exposure, as well as their children. It would also provide environmental remediation for areas in Vietnam exposed to Agent Orange and conduct a needs assessment on the Vietnamese American community. We ask you all who are attending our workshop to write to your representatives in support of the H.R. 3518 Victims of Agent Orange Relief Act of 2021. Please, there is something you can do today to help all those who have been harmed by our government's use of Agent Orange in Vietnam. Thank you so much for listening. And please, now is the moment for action.
Thank you so much, Susan, for that compelling presentation and the information, which should be very useful to us. And also, I second Susan's urging that people support Barbara Lee's bill and urge your representatives to sign on as co-sponsors. Before we hear from our final speaker, I forgot to mention that Madam Nguyen Phuong Nha, who sent us a letter of thanks on August 10th, Agent Orange Day, and who presented the Medal of Friendship to Paul Cox, is former ambassador to the UN from Vietnam. Our final speaker is Tricia Ouvre. Tricia is a master's student in gender studies and law at SOAS University of London. She is currently conducting autoethnographic research for her thesis, which focuses on the ways that identity and gender intersect within the Vietnamese diaspora in France, specifically in the context of being biracial. Tricia is a member of the collective Vietnam Dioxin, which is based in France, where she primarily works on the international aspect of the mutual fight for reparations for victims of Agent Orange. Tricia?
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to everyone who is here and for taking the time to attend this great workshop and convention put together by Veterans for Peace. I'm very excited to be here and to be able to speak to all of you about what we have been doing here in France with the collective Vietnam Dioxin in terms of activism to spread awareness about Agent Orange and the long-lasting legacy it has left. I'm a second-generation French Vietnamese from my mother's side. My family arrived in France after what's known as the fall of Saigon, which marked the end of the war. As a child of the diaspora, the issues and the damage that was left by the spread of Agent Orange is something that hits very close to home, despite not personally having family members who were directly affected by its spread. For me and for many who are a part of the diaspora and beyond, the American war and the spread of Agent Orange are a question of colonial legacy, of the need for reparations and compensation, and of memory. As a French citizen, a citizen of a nation who colonized my ancestors and mine and my family's homeland, the legacy of the war and the legacy that Agent Orange has left becomes far more complex as it directly intersects with my heritage and my identity, as it does for so many children of the diaspora. Here in France and in history books used in our middle and high schools, the American War, or what many call the Vietnam War, is studied. Children are taught about the war, when it started, who the main actors were, and when it ended. But similarly to how children in the US are not taught about the colonization of Indigenous and Native American land, we are not taught about the violent legacies that colonization and wars have left on our homeland, Vietnam. The reality is that I did not learn about Agent Orange until I was an adult and until I started reading and researching on my own. This is something that I've heard echoed within the collective and beyond here in France. Our heritage and the fact that the war has left a scarring legacy of health and environmental destruction has been essentially erased from the history that we are taught. We are too often left to learn and piece together our identities on our own, something that my white French peers have not had to do. Before I continue, I have to say that I am not speaking in the name of Trentonia, but only as a member of the collective Vietnam Dioxin. The opinions and comments expressed in today's workshop are mine and are not necessarily a representation of Mrs. Trentonia. So the collective was created in the early 2000s in France. We advocate for recognition and reparations towards victims of Agent Orange, especially in Vietnam, but also more largely for all victims of ecocides, a crime which is still not recognized by French law. The collective was founded after second and third generation members of the Vietnamese diaspora in France realized that the issue of Agent Orange was something they had never learned about in school and did not learn about until they were well into their 20s. They believed, and rightfully so, in the need for awareness to be spread regarding this and subsequently founded the collective. Beyond our work that's specific to Agent Orange, we are an organization which fights for justice and mutual liberation. We are involved in supportive and working with environmental groups, anti-racist movements, feminist movements, LGBTQIA+ movements, and anti-ableist movement. Our fight has always been and will always be intersectional in nature. Our collective has members from various backgrounds and across several generations, with a large number of us being in our 20s and 30s. This makes the collective so particular as many of us are either second or third generation Vietnamese, having only visited Vietnam a handful of times or not at all. Some also have no direct heritage linked to Vietnam, but are particularly passionate about this issue, as there is a large environmental movement which exists in France. One of the most powerful tools that we use to mobilize younger generations like mine has been social media such as Instagram and Twitter, which allows us to reach a younger and wider public. It's also important to know that there is a very particular context in France where social movements and activism are ever present in French culture and in the French context across different issues. A little bit more background about the collective: we're entirely volunteer run. And each member helps however they can and within their capacity, their expertise, and the time that they have. One of the things that has also been particularly important to how we run this is our firm belief in running our organization in a horizontal manner and not in a hierarchical one, which means that each member gets a say in the final decision process and that no voice is more dominant than another, especially in the context of many of us having marginalized identities. I joined the collective in the beginning of December 2020 after finding it through Instagram. Although I have been working with the collective for a number of months now, I have not been involved nearly as long as some of the other members who truly have done so much of the uplifting and organizing around raising awareness on what Agent Orange is and on the consequences of it, as well as around Trentonia's trial. I will now give a brief background on who she is, who Trentonia is, and why she's relevant to our workshop today. She's an incredibly courageous and strong woman who fought as a part of the resistance to liberate South Vietnam during the war. During that time, she was sprayed by Agent Orange and worked in several zones which were being sprayed and had been impacted by the herbicide. And she describes the first time that she was exposed to the deadly herbicide as being fully enveloped by a white cloud which rapidly sank to the ground, and remembering that she almost suffocated from the sticky liquid which covered her. At the time, she did not know that this was Agent Orange, as no one but the US government and the manufacturers of Agent Orange really knew what it was and how dangerous it was, and still is. As a result of her exposure to Agent Orange, she's developed several illnesses. She now has cancer, along with having type 2 diabetes, genetic abnormalities, and hypertension, tuberculosis. Her children and grandchildren are also impacted by this exposure. She lost her first child due to congenital heart defects, and her two other daughters both live with severe asthma, heart issues, and other genetic defects. Her story is incredibly relevant to our workshop today, not only because she has been a direct victim, but also because a trial of her lawsuit was held and dismissed this year. The legal procedures started in 2014, so 7 years ago now. The procedures were originally against 37 firms. The number was then reduced to 26 due to the merging or disappearing of those firms. From those 26 firms, 14 of them stood trial this January, like Monsanto, Dow Chemicals, Uniroyal, or Hercules Incorporated. Trentonia obtained French nationality after her arrival in France and her naturalization. And as she is French Vietnamese and was directly exposed by Agent Orange during the war, she fulfilled all the requirements under French law to sue the American companies responsible for producing and distributing Agent Orange. To our knowledge, she has been the only person to be able to do this currently. After several rescheduling of the trial date, partly due to the pandemic, it was held on January 25th, 2021. The fact that her trial was held is in itself a historic moment and a victory despite its outcome. There have been several cases filed against Dow, Monsanto, and others, but none have ever gone as far as she has. Her case and the movement and awareness that were raised around her set a precedent for other victims of Agent Orange, especially Vietnamese victims. Since Trentonia first filed her case with the French justice system, the lawyers of the chemical firms have done everything in their power to slow down the process. They have raised incidents which require lengthy and expensive official translations of documents. As they are multinationals, they have financial abilities that we and Trentonia did not and do not have. They are very aware of this, and the power that their money holds is evident when we look at the 20+ lawyers who sat on the defense versus Nhia's 3 lawyers. Following this lengthy process to finally have a trial held, and despite the fact that Trentonia fulfilled all the requirements to sue the US multinationals, the French court dismissed her case, stating that it did not have jurisdiction to judge a case involving the US government's wartime actions. Her lawyers said that they were using an outdated interpretation of the law when dismissing this case. So what now? On January 30th, right after her trial was held, the collective held a large rally in support of Trentonia, victims of Agent Orange, and other victims of ecocides. On May 15th of this year, 5 days after Nhia's lawsuit was dismissed, we co-organized the International March Against Monsanto here in France, not only to march against the multinational, but also to emphasize that despite the dismissal of Nhia's case, we were still standing by her side and supporting her as well as other victims of Agent Orange. 3 days ago, on August 10th, marked the 60th anniversary of the first spread of Agent Orange. Due to the pandemic, we're not able to put together a large event as we had hoped to do, but we're able to put together an art show by a French-Vietnamese artist who, through her drawing, art, and comic strips, depicts the spread of Agent Orange and the impact that it still has today. Although the spread of Agent Orange occurred more than 60 years ago, its damages are intergenerational and continue to still affect over 3 million victims across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The need for recognition of Agent Orange as a war crime and the need for reparations to the victims is something that we consider to be a necessity. We are still fighting, and we will continue to fight for justice, reparations, and mutual liberation no matter what. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tricia, for your presentation and your work and telling us about the important case filed by Trentonia. My understanding is that she is appealing the result that was reached at trial. Thank you to all of our panelists, and we, in the remaining time, would now move to a question and answer period. I know there are many U.S. veterans from the American War in Vietnam that are attending this workshop, and I urge you to put your comments in the chat. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. We have 2 questions so far. First, by Nate, how many generations have effects of Agent Orange been seen? And I believe that Susan mentioned 1961, and then Dr. Fong began to discover the connection when she started delivering babies with deformities. Do you want to add or add anything, Susan, to that?
Sure, just quickly. And the quick answer is we don't know. What we do know is that there is a dioxin receptor in the body, and that the dioxin can in fact be transferred from generation to generation. We have seen the first generation, obviously the children of American veterans who were in Vietnam, and particularly the children of the Army Chemical Corps and the ranch handers. And we have seen it go again into a second and third generation. That's as far as we know. There are studies that have been done on the children in Italy, of Seveso, Italy, where there was an industrial accident that spread dioxin into the atmosphere. There is now a third generation study that has identified that dioxin has been transferred generation to generation, even when there has been no exposure to the dioxin. So that study we use to identify the transmission through generations. I would suggest that goes to the third generations. I'm sorry, Tricia, you were going to say something.
I was going to say essentially the same thing, that it's across second and third generations as far as we know right now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Steve, wanting to know if there has been any recognition or treatment or compensation for Vietnam veterans from South Korea and or Australia. And Korean veterans get help from their government, but we don't really know about Australian vets. Do you have anything to add to that, Susan?
I believe there were also studies that were done in Australia, and there as a result of the studies, there's compensation.
Okay, great. Thank you for that.
And, I'm sorry, and also some of our major studies are coming out of South Korea. So they're actively checking out the health impacts. That's where bladder cancer, hypothyroidism, and Parkinson's-like symptoms came to the United States, was through the studies done in South Korea.
Thank you, Susan. We have another question asking whether Dr. Phuong's slides can be made available. Susan, do you have any word on that?
What we would appreciate is getting your information. We certainly can help make Dr. Phuong's presentation available. We would like to do this through another presentation of those involved in the workshop to keep on educating people and reaching people about the importance of signing on to the legislation. So yes, please let us know who would be interested, and we'll be more than happy to follow up and speak and have Dr. Phuong's presentation.
Thank you. We have another question from Stephen, who asks, what is the best scientific research site to keep current on the advancement of covered illnesses?
The best resource that I found is the one that began in 1991, and it's a continual update on veterans and Agent Orange. So I'm constantly looking at that information. Veterans Administration also has a site where they identify the presumed illnesses and some of the corroborating studies. The Institute of Medicine, National Academies of Science is really the best site to identify the current studies that are going on and their recommendations.
Thank you, Susan. I would like to urge all attendees at this workshop to contact your Congress members and urge them to sign on as co-sponsors to HR 3518. That's HR 3518, the Victims of Agent Orange Relief Act of 2021. Are there other questions, or Susan or Tricia, would you like to make some closing comments? Susan?
Sure, thank you. It is important to remember that although our focus is on Agent Orange dioxin and the harm that was done by the American government 60 years ago that continues today because of a failure to recognize the harm that's been done, that we feel this is one very important example of the ongoing destruction and death created by the United States government. And we talk a lot about looking to the future when we can have reconciliation between the people of Afghanistan, the people of Iraq, and the American people. Just a quick reminder that Ho Chi Minh always said when there were meetings with him, it's not the American people who are the enemy, it is the government. And today we see our government with over 800 bases across the world. We have a lot of work to do as people who work for peace and justice and liberation of all people throughout the world. This is one example. Please join us in supporting the bill and join and work with us towards peace and hopefully reconciliation between former enemies. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. And there are two more questions. One from Rachel. Would you be interested in starting a campaign to stop selling Roundup at major hardware store chains?
We will certainly work with you, Rachel. Absolutely.
And then a question from Bill. Tricia, did you attend the gathering at Trocadero Plaza?
No, I did not because I couldn't at the time, but I know that a lot of the members of the collective were there themselves and that it was quite a large movement despite the pandemic.
Tricia, would you like to make any closing comments?
Well, I would like to thank everyone for being here and for taking the time to listen to this and to learn more about this issue that's incredibly important. As we're an entirely volunteer-run collective, we generally ask for people that if they have the financial means to do it, to donate to victims of Agent Orange in Vietnam, so to VAVA, for example, who's one of the big organizations there. And that's generally just what we ask for, and I would like to thank everyone again.
Thank you, Tricia. I wanted to follow up on a comment that Susan just made about Ho Chi Minh saying that he knew the difference between, that they understood the difference between the American government and the American people. And along those lines, after I served on the Inquiry Commission for Victims of Agent Orange in 2009 in Paris, a while later, we sent a delegation to Vietnam. I was president of the National Lawyers Guild at the time, and we met with the president of Vietnam, and we were permitted to ask a few short questions. And I asked him how the Vietnamese people were still able to be friendly with the American people as the US government was dropping incredible numbers of bombs on that country and destroying the environment. And he responded, we always knew that the American people were our friends. And it was one of the most moving moments of my life. I just wanted to add that. Are there any other comments? I think we may have one. No, I don't. We don't have any more questions and answers. And we certainly appreciate the comments in the chat, some from US veterans of the American War describing their experiences, And thank you all for the questions. So if there are no further comments, I want to thank you all for coming and attending this very important workshop on the continuing legacy of the Vietnam War 60 years later, and urge you once again to contact your Congress members to sign on as co-sponsors to HR 3518, very important legislation to achieve compensation and support for Vietnamese victims of Agent Orange, US veterans, and Vietnamese Americans as well. Thank you so much.